It's interesting that when you look at the word honor and what honorable means, it is said to deem something or someone to have great value. Honor is to esteem somebody or to see them as somebody that is worthy of lifting up. They are someone of distinction. They have glory. They also have prestige and fame. It was interesting when I read that story. Who's familiar with Grimm's Tale? Yeah, who's familiar with? Yeah, some of you are. Interesting. This is one of Grimm's Tale, the grandson and the grandfather. And I saw that story and I thought, if that woman was in a Samoan home and treated the elderly like that, mercy. Because in my culture, in the Samoan culture, the word honor is usually given to the elderly. It is usually shown by those that are of a younger generation towards their elders. And to treat someone with honor is usually given to someone that they respect. And fair enough. And so it's an interesting thing when you look at that. In looking at this whole idea of honor, and especially being that it's Mother's Weekend, and today, as Lorinda and I were talking about today's program, the honoring of women that has made an impact in our own lives. And of course, every single one of us has a mother. So we want to honor you mums and honor the mothers in our midst. I also read an article leading up to this where today is a very painful day for a lot of women and a lot of people. For some, it is because they cannot celebrate Mother's Day with their mum because their mother is no longer with them. And for a lot of women, there is a mixed bag of emotions that come with a day like today. So for my own mum, you know, usually I say I'm the eldest and I am her number one and her favorite. But the truth of the matter is I'm not her number one because she lost her firstborn at childbirth, who was a beautiful boy. So I have an older brother and she could have had 5 kids. And I think she's very thankful she has 4 because I was enough. And also there are women amongst us that would love to start a family with somebody and have the whole title of being a mum, because in a way that's kind of an achievement too for some. And today's a painful day, and I acknowledge that. And then there are mums who are in a position with somebody to have children and to be called a mum, but cannot. I acknowledge you today. And so we honor that. I also looked into the area of honoring women. And for those who are familiar with Forbes is a business magazine in the States where they are well known for rankings and listings. And I think it was late in 2015. I just had a very quick look, and this is a snapshot off my phone. Really awesome technology. And this is probably the top 6, almost top 7 of the world's 100 most powerful women in the world. So this is Forbes ranking. And of course, I actually would love to sit down and have a conversation with Angela Merkel, because she's number 1. In the world's most powerful people, she is actually number 2. That's how amazing she is. And I think her plate is rather full at the moment. She's Germany, and she's 61, by the way. And she's a pretty amazing one. Of course, Hillary Clinton comes close to that. But these are the representation of 100 women. Obama's wife, Michelle, comes in at number 10, I think. Really interesting list of the most influential and powerful women. They range from politics, and obviously with Angela, she's in politics, in finance and automotive, CEO positions, from social media, you name it, they are amongst them. And Angela is number 2, and there's another, Janet, is number 6 of the world's most powerful people, listing according to Forbes. But probably a couple of 3 young women that I would love to, I think they're pretty honorable in terms of what they do, and I'd love to see that slide, are these 3 women. Now, one of them you probably recognize because her photo has been up a couple of times. But the young lady on the left, her name is Shiza Shahid. According to Forbes, these three Pakistani women are amongst the world's most powerful young women under 30. And so three of them are Pakistani women. Shiza Shahid is actually Malala, who is on the far right. She was the co-founder of the Malala Fund. When Shiza heard of the story of Malala, she actually flew and sat by her bed while she was recovering from the shooting that Malala was in because of the Taliban that shot her in the face for the fact that she stood up and was rallying for education of women. So Shiza, while Malala was in hospital, Malala, in her very weak and drug-induced state, said, I want to continue my fight. So Shiza actually funded or co-founded the fund that now is in operation in ensuring that Malala's fight for women in education and empowering women actually continues even to this day. And she's one of the world's most powerful young women under 30. The one in the middle, she's really cute. If you hear her talk on TED Talk, it's pretty amazing. She giggles a lot, but yet powerful. This young lady, her name is Khalida Brohai, and she comes from a small little village in Pakistan, and she became an activist when one of her friends was killed in an honor killing. So for those of you who are familiar with what happens, her friend decided that she wasn't going to go ahead with the marriage that was arranged for her because she was abused on all levels of abuse. So she left her husband and wanted to marry, the guy that she actually loved and wanted to marry. The village actually killed her, and they call it the honor killing. And of course, some of you are familiar with, and so Khalid is actually fighting at the moment to protect women from the whole move of honor killing. Which actually exists. And of course, you've heard of Malala, who continues her fight for empowering women and empowering women to be educated, not just in Pakistan, but around the world in areas that don't have education. Brilliant young women. Brilliant young women. But this next one is probably one of my favorites. Who has heard of Lizzie Velasquez and her story? So today in Sabbath school, we had to share, Heather asked to share a story or something new that we have tried or learnt this week. I learnt this story for the first time this week. This is Lizzie Velasquez. She has a congenital disease which doesn't permit her to put on weight. Lucky her. Anyway, but the thing is, Lizzie's story started when one day she was in her room wanting to search for music to listen to. And while she was scrolling through her screen, she saw, I think she was on YouTube, she saw on the side of the screen a picture that looks very similar to her. And so she clicked on this picture, and sure enough, it was an 8-second video with no sound. But on this video was her face, and on top of this video, it said, "The ugliest woman in the world." 5 million viewers actually had gone to this YouTube, and she said in her TED Talk, she's done a TED Talk, and interestingly enough, as she was walking up to the platform, she said all the notes that she had prepared for this TED Talk went out the window, and she just got up and spoke from her heart and told her story. And so she said that while she was in her room, just shocked that her face even made it to the screen of the internet, but that she saw thousands of comments. And you know what's really sad? She said not one of them was positive or affirming. In fact, the first comment that she made probably was a turning point in the way that she reacted to this story. The first comment that she read said, do yourself a favor and do the world a favor. Go get a gun and put it to your head. And that was basically the genre of all the comments that she had read, thousands of them, millions of viewers that had gone through. She is now an inspirational speaker. She's 27, and the doctors told her parents that she probably will never see, talk, or walk. She's 27, and one of her goals was to graduate, have a degree, which she has done. She wanted to write a book. She's about to actually publish 3 books. And she wanted to be a motivational speaker and inspire others. And one of the most beautiful things when I heard her speak on TED is she said every negative comment that is ever said to her and about her, she has used it as a ladder to get to her next goal. Inspiring. And I honor her, because to be deemed the ugliest woman in the world and for millions of people to view, my word, my mother heart, my woman heart, my heart just cried with sadness. And this is probably a beautiful thing of herself. This is one of her quotes that Huffington Post has actually posted. You know, when we honor people, it is usually because of the accolades, or usually because of the successes that they have done. And of course, I've mentioned a few of them. And there are, thousands of people, women included, who are successful and we want to honor. And it's interesting that when you look through the Bible, and we don't have a whole lot of time, so today I'm going to give you a teaser of what could potentially be a series in itself. Of 5 women that the Bible actually honors, that God honored. And not for any great thing that they've done, other than the fact that God chose them and God honored them, even with the interesting twists of their lives and decisions that they make. So I'm going to go through them very quickly. The first one of these women is Tamar, and I want you to take your Bibles and I want you to mark Genesis chapter 37 to 38. Tamar's story comes to us as one of the very first women. When you go through the genealogy of Jesus in the account of the Gospel of Matthew, she's named. She's named as the mother of one of Judah's sons. Tamar, we find her story, and she is introduced to us by when Judah left his brothers. It is just after they have sold Joseph into slavery. In fact, they came back to find where Joseph was and found that he had been taken. And so we have this story in chapter 37 of Genesis, where Judah actually leaves his brothers and he goes to find himself a wife. And the story tells us that he went and found himself a wife, and he found himself a Canaanite wife, the story tells us. And so they had children. They, in fact, had 3 sons. The firstborn, Judah went to find him a wife. And Tamar comes to us, or is introduced to us, as the wife that Judah finds for his son According to the Bible, Tamar and married. But what happened was, in the eyes of God, was wicked, and so God put an end to him. Pretty straightforward, but pretty strong language that is used as with regards to this story. When you look at the word wicked was used for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, or the children of Eli when they were wicked in the temple, and of course their end wasn't all that amazing. So was put to death by God, basically. And so Tamar mourned. But there was a second brother, and as the custom would have it, that if you become a widow and there is another kinsman, that you will be able to marry this so that you are able to have an offspring. They married. Onan was the next brother, but what happened was he didn't want to give Tamar a baby because the firstborn that they have together will be the heir of his brother, not his. And so he did everything he could, and you can read the story for yourself. And you will find out what happened, that he made sure that she wasn't going to get pregnant. The Lord saw this as an unfaithful thing and wicked, and so put an end to him as well. Judah, this is how important having an heir was, and this is quite intense as far as the story is concerned. Like I said, this is express version. And so Judah promised Tamar that he will give her his youngest son when he grows up. Imagine that. You are going to wait till the youngest son actually grows up, and then you'll marry him, and you're going to have the heir of the tribe of Judah. Unfortunately, Tamar went to her family. It didn't eventuate, and Judah had no intention of giving his youngest son to Tamar in fear of the fact that he may end up like the two older brothers. So Tamar took things into her own hands. She found out that Judah was going to be in town. She disguised herself as a prostitute. She went and sat by the city gate, saw Judah come along. The story have it that she tempted him. He fell. They got pregnant. And that's how the story ends. Well, of course, for those of you who know the story well, read it in Genesis chapter 37 and 38. She made sure that, she had something of Judah just in case she did become pregnant, and which he gave her. And so when she did become pregnant, and the laws of the time, if you became pregnant outside of wedlock, that you will be stoned to death or put to death. A lot of death. But that's what happened. Anyway, she said she was pregnant. Judah finds out because he's one of the honorable men of the town. He says, well, the laws put her to death. But of course, she had something of his, which then showed him up to be the father of her child, which in the story it says that she ended up having twins. The story goes that Judah acknowledged that this was indeed his doing, and Tamar and he eventually became husband and wife. She is a Canaanite woman, a woman that when you read the genealogy of Jesus, she is named as one of the 5 women that is named in the genealogy of Jesus. And here, as you hear the story of Jesus and the foretold prophecy of this Messiah that was going to come, he was going to come through the tribe of Judah. And their mother, or great greats of grandmother, Tamar, a Canaanite woman whom God honored not because of her choice, but God honored her. It's an interesting thing when we look at this whole idea of honorable women or honorable men. And is it because the person is honorable by their doing? Or is it because of circumstance? Or in this case, because God in his grace and mercy saw that she can become a part of his line? An interesting one. So the questions for you, and I invite you to read the story of Tamar. In fact, Francine Rivers, in her book Lineage of Grace, gives her perspective as an author to all of these women, and Tamar being the first of them. So here are a few questions for you, both for you women and for men. How do you identify with Tamar? How would you do differently? Have you ever taken matters into your own hands? Because for Tamar, she was promised an heir from the tribe of Judah. And she made sure she was going to get it. And so she took matters into her own hands. Have you ever taken matters into your own hands and gone ahead of God? What about Judah and his deception? How would you have dealt with Judah if you were one of the elders of the time? Judah was confronted by God and by Tamar. Have you ever been privately or publicly been confronted of things that you have said or done? How did you respond? Have you ever been openly rebuked or embarrassed or corrected? What was your response to that? How would you have done things differently if you were Judah? How would Judah have done things differently if you were his advisor? What would you have said to him? How is God's character revealed in this story? I say God honored Tamar, but do you think that is actually the case? The next woman, express version of these women, Rahab, and you will find her story in Joshua chapter 2 to 6. So you can read that for yourself when you get a chance. So Rahab comes to us because Joshua secretly sent 2 spies into Jericho. Jericho is a land that they've been scouting out, and they needed to send 2 men into this city to see what the state and the feel of the city is. It just so happens that they come by the prostitute's house, Rahab. And so the story tells us that these spies were in her house. The king of Jericho finds out, sends men over to Rahab's house and asks her whether they are there. The story says Rahab stands there in front of the men of the king and said, I don't know. In fact, I think they've gone that direction. So if you go now, you will find them. When all along, she had these 2 men hiding on the top of her roof, because on top of there are flax, and it's part of the time and culture where they dry things on top of the roof. And of course, they wouldn't go there because these men knew that actually happens amongst the town. And so she hid them there. The story tells us that the spies hid there until the men went. And so before the spies went to sleep, in Joshua 2, chapter 2, verse 8 to 11, it says, before the spies went to sleep that night, Rahab went up on the roof to talk with them. I know the Lord has given you this land, she told them. We are all afraid of you. Everyone in the land is living in terror. For we have heard how the Lord made a dry path for you through the Red Sea when you left Egypt. And we know what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 Amorite kings east of the Jordan River, whose people you completely destroyed. No wonder our hearts have melted in fear. No one has the courage to fight after hearing such things. For the Lord your God is the supreme God of the heavens above and below. So she starts listing off to the spies what it is that her people think and have heard of with regards to the people of Israel. Interestingly enough, some of the writers have suggested that the mere fact that Rahab and the story of how the Jericho people have felt, the victory that Israel had gone through, and I'm not sure how I feel about that, but their victory hinged on what she actually said, because when the spies went back to Joshua, their report to Joshua was exactly what Rahab had said. They are trembling in fear, they are afraid, and therefore I think it's safe for us to go and take them. Now, we know that God had other plans, and when you read the story, there was very specific plans of how Israel was going to take Jericho. But Rahab and her role in this story is very, very crucial. Because Rahab made a covenant with these spies, and for those of you who are familiar with this story, know that they had an agreement. She and her family were going to be the only people, or whoever was going to be in her home, that were going to be rescued. And so it goes. The story of Jericho unfolds. And in Joshua chapter 6, verse 22 to 23, while they were marching around, meanwhile, Joshua said to the 2 spies, keep your promise, go to the prostitute's house and bring her out, along with all of her family. The men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father, mother, and brothers, and all the other relatives who were with her. They moved her family to a safe place near the camp of Israel. And the rest is history, because Rahab, again, is mentioned not only in the genealogy of Jesus, but in Hebrews, her faith has also been acknowledged. A prostitute, a woman that God had actually placed honor upon, not because of her occupation, which is a very interesting way of looking at it. But would we deem her honorable? Have you ever done a family tree and looked at all the interesting people in your family tree? Imagine having her great-grandchildren going through their line of heritage and find what kind of occupation she had. But yet, God placed honor on her. So, as expressed and quick as we've gone through this story, if you know this story, how would you identify with Rahab? Or do you? How would you have changed this story? Could you? What is your response to the fact that she is part of the genealogy of Jesus? How do you tell this story with all of its interesting twists? Rahab, in her fear of the visitors and her God, strikes up a deal. How do you know she was sure that they were going to keep their promise? If you were in Rahab's shoes, what kind of a deal would you have made? Have you ever had to make a covenant or an agreement with a stranger where your life depended upon? How did you go? Rahab and her family were shut inside the city wall during the march of the Israelites. The walls of Jericho were falling around them. How do you know of how they coped? How would you have coped if you were in that position? Or in our day? Are you like Rahab, where you feel like you're trapped inside your walls with everything falling on around you? How are you coping? Upon whom did Rahab base her faith? And upon whom do you base your faith? And how is God's character revealed in the story of Rahab? The third one, which we all love this story, and we know this young lady very well because her story is probably one that's preached probably a lot, and that is the story of Ruth. We know her as the Moabite woman who married the son of Abimelech. Oh, mercy. Elimelech. This is a tongue twist. And of course, as the story goes, that her husband died and she was left with her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law was in a foreign land and she refused to leave her mother-in-law. We know the story. And so she finds herself following her mother-in-law all the way back to her hometown. And we see that Ruth in this story is one of honor and of loyalty and of faithfulness in looking after a mother that is not of her own and left her own mother behind. Knowing this story, how would you have coped if you were Ruth? Or Naomi, for that matter? Would you have followed Naomi? What was it about Naomi that Ruth admired and adored and wanted to follow her to her own land for and became the foreign woman in this land? She was quite misfortuned, but she rose above it. How would you deal with misfortune and calamities? How would you align yourself with another's faith if you were a foreigner? You know, it's interesting as I was reading these stories and just in reflections, just really quickly, and the mere fact that the women and the young women that I've shared their story before, you know, they're living in a time when they can actually share their story as authentically and as they wish to share them, just like we have an opportunity to share our stories. And as I was reading through these women's stories, I wonder whether they knew that down in history that their stories were going to be told, and how would they have liked their stories to be told. You know, I always think about this. And so for Ruth, you know, another foreign and another reflection that I have had this week as I was thinking about these women, and as you read the genealogy of Jesus, all these three women, the first three women in the line of Jesus, all foreigners. All foreigners. They were not Hebrew women. And we are in a climate in our world and in our country where we frown upon foreigners. How do we know that these foreigners could not be a blessing to our land, to our people, to our country? Sometimes I think about that and it stops me on my tracks, because when I look at these stories, these were foreign women that God honored to be a part of the lineage of Jesus. Think about that for a moment. Honored them. I'll leave that there. Who of the ladies do you identify yourself with, Ruth or Naomi? Difficult situations in life reveal our true character. What kind of report could be given about you like that of Ruth? You know, when Boaz's workers came and gave a report of her work, even though she was just picking up things after the workers, what kind of report have people given about you? Would it have been similar to that of Ruth when they gave amazing report of her? What kind of report? And how is God revealed in the story of Ruth and in the life of Ruth? The next one is really interesting because in Matthew's account of the genealogy of Jesus, Tamar is named, Rahab is named, Ruth is named. Have you read the genealogy lately? This next lady isn't actually named. She is just known as the mother of Solomon. You know who she is? Bathsheba. Yes. I don't know if you've ever read Matthew, but it was interesting. I've never really picked it up before, but I read through it and I'm like, wait a minute. He didn't even name her. And then he just went through all of the fathers and of course the mothers that were named before. And come Bathsheba, she was the wife of Uriah and the mother of Solomon. And Solomon's father was David. Interesting. But anyway, you know the story, Bathsheba, who is the woman that David committed adultery with. You think you can watch Scandal on TV and get all of that wonderful, all those 3 to 4 stories in themselves are quite interesting and scandalous. And this is not something that I encourage you to do, but when I was younger and in my teens and I was bored in sermons like some of you are probably right now, I used to read through some of these stories. They were the only things that kept me interested. I'm like, wow, oh my goodness, that's in the Bible? They actually name it. It's so explicit. Anyway, step aside. 2 Samuel chapter 11 actually gives you a story and the account of David and Bathsheba. Yes, he lusted after her. He ended up having her husband killed, who was one of his most loyal generals in the army. But yet Bathsheba, it is interesting that God honored her. But the thing that I found quite interesting, and this is, this morning it was mentioned again in our Sabbath school, the fact that God, we can talk about his grace and his mercy, and that is who he is. In Bathsheba and David's story, when she became pregnant because of the result of their affair, basically, Nathan came to David and said to David, I'm here to confront you on what you've actually done. But let me tell you this. The child that Bathsheba is pregnant with is going to die. So the story tells us that David fasted and prayed and fasted and prayed and fasted and prayed for this child. But it's been foretold that this child was going to die. And you know the story, for those of you familiar with the story. The child died. And it was interesting as you read the story that, the servants and those that were around David as he was mourning this and fasting and praying and covered in sackcloth, the story tells us that as soon as the child actually died, David actually gets up, has a bath, and then carries on with life. But yet, through Bathsheba, God honored her by having her become the line and one of the mothers that is included in the line of Jesus. It's one of those stories. I'm like, These are quite honest, authentic stories. But I wonder whether they would tell it as it is. Recently, I listened to Monica Lewinsky's TED Talk. The price of shame. And I always think about Bathsheba. Interesting. In Monica's TED Talk, she talks about the agony that she went through, I guess her story. And it was interesting, she said, the story you've heard is the story that has been told to you and that you have read, because we've all read them. We've seen the news. For those of you who that existed in that time when it all came out, she said, I lived through them, but you've never heard me talk to you about the other side of the story. And so she goes on to unpack, her story and how she coped with the affair. And she says, I fell in love with the president. That's what happened. And I wonder whether if Bathsheba was to stand before us and would say to us, I actually fell in love with the king. I fell in love with David. I wonder if that's how she would have told this story. For me, and one of the things, and it's always stuck with me now, but one of the things that she says in her TED Talk is that we all read stories. We all look at a story, and it is a commodity. It is a story. And often we look at a story and we forget the human behind the story. And so I've just told you a few stories. And these stories are women that God had honored, because not only because he had honored them, but he honored the humanity behind these stories. And, Monica Lewinsky said, the price of her shame, she hid for 10 years. 10 years she hid. And it's only now she's had the courage to stand in the limelight yet again and telling her story. And she said, often we look at stories and forget the human. Here is the human behind that story, underneath that beret and that photo that's awful and that you've seen, that was splashed across the media. Here is that story. And here is the human behind that story. And I look at Bathsheba and I'm going, there's that woman. Oh wait, there's that human woman that God honored, placed honor upon her and said, you will become part of the line where the Messiah, the tribe of Judah, will come. Bathsheba. The final one, and I guess some of the questions that I want to put to you with regards to, Bathsheba. How could they have dealt with their temptation? How could she have resisted the king? Have you ever been in a compromising situation? How did you give in or resisted that temptation? In 2 Samuel 11 verse 1 to 5 lists different ways or escape routes that David could have gone through, but he didn't. Would you have done similarly? How did the two men, David and Uriah, as you know the story, compare in this story? And what impact did their choice and choices have on the kingdom and their families? Because we often just tell the story. But there have been consequences of those choices. Have you made choices that have impacted the world that you belong to, the families, the friends around you? How have others' choices impacted your life? And to what intensity? I've said that God showed favor and honored Bathsheba still. How did God show up in her story, and how is God showing up even though we have made some awful, awful choices that have impacted other people? How is God gracious to you right now? And lastly, Mary, the obedient, unafraid young woman, whom God chose as the mother of the Messiah. A young, obedient, so we get in the story, innocent young woman. In fact, when I was looking for pictures, there is a Bedouin or one of the hippies, that if you go to some of these countries, they actually have a young girl with beautiful blue eyes that could have represented, Mary, but this is the one I chose. But here we have a young woman that God had actually honored to be the mother of Jesus. If you were Mary, to the women here in this place, how would you have responded if God called you and honored you with that responsibility? How do you identify yourself with Mary? And we've heard her story told so many times. Actually, we have heard her story, but we haven't really heard her story. Because often we just pass her by and we look, and that's where our focus should go. But sometimes I wonder if we were to spend some time with Mary and she told her story to us, how would she tell it in the honor that God had given her? The experience that she would have gone through in her village, how she felt when they had to leave Nazareth and have to head towards Bethlehem. How would she have told this story? How would you identify yourself with Mary? Of all of these women, ordinary, but yet such ugliness in their stories, God honored them. And it's not because of their successes. They became childbearing women whom the line of Jesus came through, because their careers are not to aspire to. So on this Mother's Day weekend and celebration, we celebrate you mothers. And we tell these stories of women whom themselves were mothers, but their stories also tell of our own struggles. And some of us, we might have different career paths and professions, but still the struggles are real. The above women were unlikely women to have been chosen by God as a line from which Jesus, the Messiah, the promised Messiah, was to make his entry into the world. The story of Tamar is a story of dedication, and it's dedicated to you who is struggling with abuse and injustice and in your constant yearning for justice. That's what the story of Tamar is about. The story of Rahab is dedicated also to you who think that the past mistakes define you and us, and it has the potential to ruin our future or any chance of a future. But Jesus found Rahab. The story of Ruth is a story that is honoring the faithful, the committed, the loyal. We honor that. The story of Bathsheba is dedicated to you whom have struggled with the thought that your reputation has been ruined forever. You are ruined. Thankfully, God can make beauty out of ashes. And Bathsheba, interestingly enough, is one of the ones where the unlimited grace of God was shown. And of course, Mary the obedient, a blessed young woman whom God saw favor to bestow the blessing of being the mother of our Lord and Savior. To you women who've been blessed enough to mother children, as heartbreaking as it is sometimes to mother them and see the choices that your children have made that may not be of your own, but yet God has honored you. God has honored you and has seen favor to grant you children. So no matter what path of life finds you today, I trust these stories bring courage and strength. I pray it brings hope and it strengthens your faith. I hope it confronts you with the unlimited grace and favor of our God that is ready to be poured out on you. I also hope that it confronts you of things in your life and mine that God needs to speak to you about and confront you about. Not only you know, but He knows. And I want to leave you in the capable arms of our God. Either way, God honored these women in the truest sense of the word. He showed mercy and favor and grace. And I am thankful that that same thing is offered to you and I this morning.